story that got me involved with all of this. And it was in the late 70s when I first met Cecile Hansen. I had just finished writing a manuscript of over 500 pages about prehistoric Seattle. And I had no idea that the Duwamish tribe was still around. And so his name was Mike Diefendorfer. I'm not quite sure what he was, but he was like a middleman for all sorts of stuff. And he said, well, do you know the Duwamish are still around? And I said, not at all. He said, yeah, they have an office in Buerge. Not only that, would you like to meet their chairperson? I said, sure. And so I met Cecile. I couldn't get over it. It was just a revelation to me, idiot that I am, that I didn't realize that, you know, all these thousands of years are still represented by 8 living people today. But anyway, Cecile asked me, well, after we talked about what I was doing, would you like to help the tribe? And I said, sure. And that question changed my life. So for the last half century, I've been involved with the Duwamish. And I have to say, they're unlike any other people I have ever encountered. And it is because the more I study them, I'm just drawn to the study. I always tell people I'm pursued by the theories. And the theories are basically, how is this not known? How is it that the history that I knew is so partial? Why is it not talking about these other really important things? And so I am drawn to it. I don't have really any power of that. It is something that, one, I need to understand, and I feel a need to share what I've come to learn with others. And so here I am before you, speaking in this extraordinary place. The honor of doing that is remarkable. I thank you so much for, first of all, generously inviting me into the tribe, putting up with me, and then giving me the opportunity to share what I've learned with you today. In half a century, it's like we are always coming full circle. And this is just one of those times. So what I want to talk to you, I see we don't have a slide up. Is there a reason why we're not seeing anything? The very reason why I came. Okay, anyway, so what I want to talk to you today is about, so this grand edifice sheltered a group. This group is very ancient. It actually precedes humanity. It is the hunter-gatherer group, about 15 to 35 people that is made up of several closely related families, and they form a significant group that goes out and survives in the world. But it does more to survive. It flourishes in the world. And to the point, it flourishes to the point now that we are planning for colonies of human beings on other planets, on the moon. That's how it flourishes. At some point here, people were here about 16,000 years ago. As soon as the ice retreated northward, first the plants came in, the animals that fed on the plants followed, the predators followed the animals, and the human beings finally came and joined them. That happened about 16,000 years ago. Those were hunter-gatherer bands. They lived very differently than the Duwamish did in prehistoric times, and as we do today. But we still use the idea, the hunter-gatherer band still represents itself in one, the extended family, two, the military platoon, and also the standard classroom size. That's what the extended family, you can talk to 170 students, but you really are not going to be communicating with them. 25 is a good classroom size. That's just what human beings find comfortable. Oh, it's good, very good. So that group here in the Puget Lowland discovered a way to shelter itself under a single roof, and that's this. The Longhouse was the shelter for the original hunter-gathering band. And what I think is even more remarkable than this monumental building is the group it sheltered. Because the group it sheltered is extremely complex, very subtle, and is enormously durable. It has survived for over 1 million years. The early humans developed it, They learned how to use fire, and then when fully modern humans appeared in the world, they took the fruits of that previous labor and they used it to create human societies. And in the Pacific Northwest, we see groups like this. This is a hunter-gathering group. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about it now. But they survived and flourished in a sustainable way. Now, saying those words doesn't really capture the accomplishment that it represents. To be, for example, when the pioneers came, they saw, well, when George Vancouver came in 1792, he looked at the landscape in the Puget Sound Basin when he was exploring. He said, we didn't think any human beings had anything to do with this, and we were just amazed that nature could appear to be so fertile. Well, it was fertile, and it looked as beautiful as it did because human beings had been managing it when Vancouver came for about 11,700 years. It was managed, the forests were managed. They just didn't go into the forest to collect what the forest had to offer. They actively managed the tree. And how do we know this? Because the very first surveyors that came in and surveyed the land for the townships so that people could homestead, it was a engine of genocide. But nevertheless, that's how the land was sold, the people driven off the land. In any case, virtually all the trees that they surveyed were less than 13 or 14 inches in diameter. They were smaller. As a matter of fact, the trees the pioneers encountered were smaller, and there were fewer of them than there are today in Seattle. How is that possible? We see photographs of these trees, but you know, photographs, you lack this. There's no depth. I mean, you see all these images together. Some of the trees are in the background, some in the foreground, but we see them all together. 60, 90, this is feet apart. This is how the trees were. They were burned every 3 years so that enough sunlight could come in. The trees were spaced so that herbaceous vegetation could grow that would feed the elk, the deer, and the bear who came to feed on them, and those were the game herds that people depended on. So the forest was essentially managed to provide enough forage for the game animals. The same practice was applied to the fisheries. A single weir built across a river had the capacity to catch every single fish that went upstream. But that would have been stupid, because the people who lived upstream then wouldn't have any fish, and you wouldn't have any peace. And so there were protocols that were established to manage the fishing that enabled everybody on a river course, including those farthest upstream, to have an equitable catch. And those protocols were managed through intermarriage. So the group that did it lived in these houses. And there's a few things. Did I bring up my... Yeah, my thing. That's the one, yeah. So I had to go to Mud Bay to get this, but in any case. So this is a longhouse that was built on the Nisqually River, and it was in an area that was not frequented by white settlers. They were up in the highlands growing wheat. This is in the lower valley, and this is where Mud Creek joins the Nisqually River near the town today of Yelm. And so near Yelm were people, let's see, hold on. Yeah, this pointer. Oh, wait, don't take it off. No. I just got going. Okay. What is EIKI anyway? Well, anyway, let me tell you. So they were the Yoquab Church. The Yoquab was the name of the place where Mud Creek came into the Nisqually River, and the suffix "obch" means people of. So the Yoquab were the people who lived in two longhouses at that part on the Nisqually River. And the diagram I had is of one of the longhouses, but it shows the relationship between the two longhouses. Each longhouse, typically in Puget Sound, was out marrying. That is, they were exogamous. If you wanted to marry someone, you were expected to go outside of the house group to get it. And the reason why was if you did that, then you established kinship ties with another village, which broadened your economic base. If you wanted to collect foodstuffs at places where people went, families who typically went there essentially had the right to gather supplies there. If you wanted to share in that right, you married into the family. And then that marriage right, and it gave you the right to do that. So there were two villages, and they exchanged partners. That was typically done. And again, they did this so that both could flourish. When the Americans came in, American settlers, many Native people, the Americans were violent, but they were also technically unique. They could break the Hudson's Bay Company monopoly, and they also had the ability to forge iron tools. They had the abilities to do that. So these were a very vigorous group, and because they were violent, there was a need to find a way in which the Native people would live with them, and this was through intermarriage. And so Chief Seattle particularly invited the Americans into his Duwamish homeland so that both races could share in prosperity, that they would share through intermarriage. And so he basically called upon his people, intermarry with these people. This is a powerful invading group, and we need to be on their good side, and they need to be joined with us so that we can prosper together if we're going to live in peace. It didn't work out that way, nor has the slide. So anyway, the person who lived in that longhouse, who was considered the leader, was a man named Shivs. His last name was, that is a name, Shivs Kadev was his name. The last two syllables of his name, Kadev, we hear in other names, for example, like Pat Kadev, who is the leader of the Snoqualmie. We call him Tatcana, Pat Kadev. And then there was a Duwamish chief whose name was Quilskadev. Quilskadev was renamed Tecumseh when the Quilskadev's father, old Chief Question, asked Arthur Denny, I want you to give my three sons Boston names, because they need names like yours so they can operate more efficiently and effectively in the society you're bringing into the area. And so Arthur Denny named all three sons after famous Midwestern war leaders. And Tecumseh was one of them. His name was Quilskadev. Now, that was a common name. It didn't mean they were all interrelated. But it was like the name Smith. Smith talked about people who forge iron. Thatcher is a person who thatches roof. A man with the last name of Fletcher is the one who puts feathers on an arrow. So Kadev was one of those kinds of names that was widely circulated. We think it has to do with heads, and probably with a headdress that probably signified rank. In any case, Shivs was the leader of this house. It was said that he owned the house. Well, what did he own? He owned the uprights of the house. And then there was the planking. And the planking belonged to the families. Now, see these big pillars that hold up the roof beams? The space between pillars was usually the space that was given to a family. And so we have three spaces, we have three families, and then three more on this side. So this would be a medium-sized longhouse, and it would house 6 families whose hearths were either near the walls or through the center. But in any case, this would have been the kind of house, longhouses probably would have had 4 to 5 spaces for other families. The brothers and sisters often lived together. Sometimes a sister would marry out, or a brother would marry out into a village to extend the economic base. And so they had a very widespread kin network. There was also, and if we can ever get the slide up, I'll show you, there is an interesting marriage bond that shows up in this diagram, and it is where a man marries a woman, and then he also marries the woman's daughter. Now, unless your imagination carries off, that is because it's called a spalotzid marriage. And if a woman or a husband, if a husband or a wife died, it was expected that somebody within the group would remarry them. And that provided care and protection for the person the aggrieved, the widower, but it also provided insurance for the person that was newly married to this older person. That meant that she was certainly dependent on her old group, her birth group, but also that ensured that she still had all the benefits of the house group. The house group was autonomous. Everybody in a house shared everything they got. They also had a name. That particular house that I showed you was the Yokwachach. They had a name. They were an autonomous group. They were independent of every other longhouse. Now, on a river stream, of course, you had these fishing protocols, and that meant that you had to have intermarriage. And so, as it was often said, every river has its people. And so because they were linearly organized, they had linear kinship system, they tended to have stronger leaders. And so river people, you see it in the Hudson's Bay Company records when people come in to trade at the Hudson's Bay Company. How are they identified? Well, they're the Duwamish, the Snohomish, the Skokomish, the people who lived on that river. But there were other groups, like people who lived on lakes, people who lived on the border of Puget Sound, people who lived in the mountains, the foothills of the mountains. They were also named, but that did not mean they were an exclusive group. For example, in Duwamish, you had saltwater Duwamish, Squatchach. You had river Duwamish, Stogwach. You had lake Duwamish, Hatchuach. And you had interior people who lived in the foothills, Klalidguk. And so all of these also groups intermarried with other groups, so that if you were in the interior and you wanted to dig clams, well, you would go to the kin of your kinfolk who lived along the saltwater. And if you were saltwater and you wanted to go up in the mountains to pick berries, you would accompany a family member who took you to their berry patches to do that very thing. So they were highly interconnected. But the genius, the complexity and the genius of the Winter Village group, the Alsh, the name for a house is Al, and the Alsh is the house group. The house group was independent of everybody else. It had its own leadership. Leadership of a group depended on consensus. Leadership in a house depended on consensus. The families had to agree what to do. Now, if you didn't, you could either agree to disagree, or you could move out, and that's often how other houses were formed, out of disagreements, but they nevertheless remained connected. Well, okay, that's all right. Anyway, I really didn't have much more to say about the diagram than that, except that there were people who lived in the house and people who married into the house. And the people who were married into the house had to undergo a period of probation to see whether or not they would work well with the people of the house. That might last several years. A person could be born in a house and move out, and then come back. That person still had to show that they were able to handle the regimen of a house. It was not easy living in a house group. The closest comparison I can think of so far is an English boarding school. You had 20 to 35 people living in an enclosed space for about 2 months of the year. Now, when you were outside in February, when the land began to green and it began to get warmer, families took off. And they would go to their traditional gathering spots, collect food, preserve it, bring it back, store it in the longhouse for winter. And this would carry on until November. And then usually mid to late November, they would assemble back in the longhouse. But when that happened, the interesting thing was the anxiety level among people rose measurably. And so how do you deal with that tension? Now, a lot will have happened in the 9 months they were gone. Babies would have been born, people would have died, people got married, people went on spirit quests to find supernatural guardians. Adults got older, they had experiences. Well, the way they determined to relieve the stress was by singing about it. Singing and dancing about it. And so, when the people began to return, it was also said to be the time that each individual supernatural guardian spirit or spirits came back into the house with them. And when they came into the house, the first thing that happened was that they felt ill. Which, when you think about it, you've been free for 9 months, and then you have to come back. I mean, this is a big space, but imagine it with, well, as many people as you in this house, staying for 2.5 months close together, and changes could happen. They would start to sing the songs of their power spirits, and the people who knew the songs would join in, and pretty soon other people would begin singing and dancing in the house, and then kin from other villages would show up, and kin from this village would move on to go to other villages, and it was a religious season in which groups of people moved from house to house to sing the power songs and reestablish unity in the house. It was brilliantly done. And then, when winter got very cold, and even if your house is insulated, it's going to be cold inside too, that was the season where if you were very old, or you were an infant, you were likely to die. And so, when in a house you had several social classes. You would have the people who were called sial, the noble people. And they would have been maybe a third of the people in the Longhouse. They were the wealthy ones. And because they were wealthy, they were assumed to have leadership skills, and many did. Virtually everybody else was takra, which means common people. So they did what common people do. The nobles called them worthless people because they didn't have powerful names like they did. They didn't have powerful supernatural spirits that made them wealthy. But if you were wealthy, you had an obligation to give your wealth away. This is another brilliant social custom that was developed on the northwest coast. We call it potlatch. Here in Puget Sound, it was called squegway, come, come. And a noble host, a wealthy host, would offer a feast that would last for weeks in some cases. There'd be athletic contests, there'd be gambling matches, there'd be secret society initiations, there'd be marriages, coming of age ceremonies, naming ceremonies. It would all happen in these potlatches. But the function of a potlatch was for a chief who had amassed wealth to give it away. So they needed both. They needed the, what do we call them, the doers and shakers, the people driven to those kinds of things, to become leaders, to become wealthy. They existed in a house of commoners, and then the commoners expected them, if they were to live up to their noble pedigree, to give their wealth away on occasion. Might be years between. In a lot of ways, it's like a sabbatical year, which amongst the ancient Hebrew, every 7 years, all debts were canceled. So that way the society could maintain a social equilibrium without conflict or envy or anger, or let's say less of those things. The same thing happened here, but in a way that's rather unique to the Pacific Northwest, to the Puget Sound people. All those give us an idea of just how you win some, you lose some. Anyway, just how complex the society was, but how ingenious it was. The organization, now you had groups that, for example, when they collected foods, in this particular environment, when the salmon were just coming in droves upstream, it was the same time that berries were ripest in the hills. So you've got these two very important food sources. Salmon are your protein, berries are your vitamins. You have to have both. So how does a longhouse divide itself so that there are enough families collecting berries and enough families collecting salmon? Well, those are the decisions that had to be made within that longhouse community. And so there was a structure of order, but it was all, it was consensus. Leadership was based on consensus. Everybody pretty much had to agree to it, or agree to disagree, but the point was, it worked. And if it didn't work, the longhouse would break up, and you'd have to start again. But the point was, most of it worked all the time, because some longhouse groups often lasted the house itself. Although the house would have to be replaced, say, every 20, 25 years, the group persisted, sometimes for centuries, sometimes for millennia. We have middens that go back over 1,000 years, right by single places where longhouses were, which meant the group was pretty much the same too. It changed over time, but nevertheless, it was that named group. So the people in it were as impressive, if not more so, than the structure Yes, that they inhabited. And I'd like to leave you with that it is the people inside that make the culture. And the Longhouse simply reflects the breadth of their vision and the grandeur of their sensibilities. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.